Good morning, all of you. For those of you just coming in, we have a few seats down here in the front. I guess my sense of humor. Anyway, thank you, those of you who are able to be here in person this morning. It's lovely to see you. We realize people will still be coming in. I want to get started, though, because I want to make sure that Professor Dahl has an opportunity both to give us his presentation. Hopefully have time for questions and exchange at the end. And hello to all of you on Zoom as well. Thank you for Zooming in. So I am delighted. We're just having a conversation. This is our fourth try. We have been beset with calamities in trying to do what I have wanted to do for maybe 12 years now, which is to be able to have Ron here in the Department of Psychiatry and to hear about what is interesting him right now and the work that he's doing. He is a professor of public health and community health sciences at UC Berkeley. He was the founding director of the Center for the Developing Adolescent, and until I believe 2023 served for 12 years as the director of the Institute for Human Development and served previously as president of Society for Research on Child Development. Just a bit about his background. He completed his MD at UPMC. Did a pediatric residency at Duke, a research fellowship at Western Psych, and then he joined the faculty at UPMC until 2010 when he was lured west to come to UC Berkeley. His academic accomplishments are impressive to say the least. I checked last night, Google Scholar notes 443 publications and an H-index of 130. He's amassed more than 60,000 citations, which in my view is kind of the clearest view of the kind of impact someone is having on our field and on their colleagues. He has a seminal review in 2012 with E.A. Crone in Nature Reviews Neuroscience that alone has garnered more than 3,200 cites. He has so much extramural funding that I tried counting twice and just lost track. So a lot, many pages. Overall, he has had truly a singular career as a pediatrician and developmental scientist who studies brain maturation, sleep, and affective systems, how they interact to shape health, motivation, and risk behavior. He is quintessentially interdisciplinary. His work integrates neuroscience, medicine, public health, and focuses on adolescence as a developmental period with unique, important opportunities for early intervention in relation to a wide range of behavioral and emotional health problems. Ron, we are thrilled to have you back. Wonderful to see you. Hope we get to see you much more wandering around the halls of Nancy Crump's building.
Thank you very much. It's exciting to be here and to be able to share some ideas. I really appreciate the introduction. I do want to highlight very, very boldly that everything that I have done and that I've been fortunate to be able to contribute to has been through teams, and amazing teams at the University of Pittsburgh, and an amazing team of teams that I've been involved with at Berkeley. And I think this is part of the deeper message, not only personally and the motivation working as part of teams, but I think as these challenges and problems and opportunities that we're going to talk about to really support young people in impactful ways requires teams. These are complex issues that are not going to be solved within any single discipline. And they are, the compelling nature of these really highlights the importance for the right kinds of teams. And so teaming with this team is really an inspiring possibility that we've been discussing. So I want to begin by framing the broad goals that I want to bring a developmental science perspective, and I'm going to unpack what I mean by that developmental science perspective. And I'm going to focus on a set of disorders, but mainly anxiety, depression, and to some degree loneliness as a symptom space that is quite important, as we will talk about in the end, and to really bring this integrative, transdisciplinary frame, not just to get actionable insights into mechanisms for disorders, but as a way of understanding windows of opportunity for learning and development that can improve trajectories. So we all know this is so evident that adolescence is this period of vulnerabilities and challenges. That's why there was so much funding for so many years for these studies, because of the importance of these issues. Approximately 75% of mental disorders begin by age 25 or have roots in the periods prior to adulthood. And over the past decade, as we all know, there's been escalating rates of emotional distress, loneliness, and mental health problems among youth. And from a global perspective, this is particularly important because the largest generation of adolescents that have ever existed, the largest proportion of the world population as being adolescents, is currently happening. And this 1.2 billion adolescents in the world are growing up amidst increasing challenges. What I was mentioning at the beginning, single discipline or single system approaches, just thinking about these as medical problems, just thinking about them as population health problems, just thinking about them as economic and poverty-rooted problems, just thinking about how school-based community support or clinical support by itself is not currently meeting the growing challenges. And so I want to bring a bit of this perspective on adolescence as a window of opportunity. This is a paper we published in 2018 in Nature. As a group, again, this group, actually a key group with the Center for the Developing Adolescents. And Nature did an entire issue on the science of adolescence in 2018. And this was a lead article because the argument in this paper was the importance of investing in adolescence in the same way we invest in early childhood, in the same way that we've had global impact by recognizing that the perinatal period and first few years of life are formative, and investing in improving the growth and development of young children makes a big measurable difference in a variety of ways. And this argument is, so does adolescence. Adolescence is a second window of opportunity that deserves investment. And that's in part because it's a period of rapid growth, multi-level dynamic change, a lot of fundamental and formative learning processes. And there are shifts in these neural systems that contribute to increased sensation seeking, increased sensitivity to social evaluation, changes in sleep and circadian regulation, as we'll talk about later, changes in motivational salience of social dynamics, interacting with peers, status, respect, prestige, as well as sexual and romantic interests. And so together, and a number of our papers over the past several years have been focusing on adolescence as a formative period of social learning, identity development, and a time that there are natural proclivities for bond formation, relationship formation that are different than in the juvenile period. This is part of the story of the compelling case for investing in adolescence. So when I talk about developmental science, it is its own field in some ways, but I want to emphasize what I want to call integrative developmental science. It's been the driving framework for a number of our teams, where we're fascinated by developmental neuroscience, particularly developmental social and affective neuroscience, the developmental psychology of the processes for learning and development, the science of learning, which has been exploding, not just related to AI and computational models of learning, but really thinking mechanistically about shifts in learning priorities in new ways. And of course, population health, social, clinical, policy, implementation sciences. And I also want to highlight what has been, which is strange to some people, a deepening interest in part of our team on anthropological and evolutionary perspectives. So I'm going to give a couple examples of that today, but that could be a whole talk in and of itself. It's been fascinating to really understand how the human life history evolved with an extended period of social and emotional learning for several years. That is probably an important part of how our species operates at a really deep level. But let me just give a couple pragmatic framing ideas around this concept. What do we mean by developmental? If we're using bits of lots of different disciplines and putting them together, well, what's developmental? And it comes down in a more practical way to thinking about developmental continuities and discontinuities that allow us to get inferences about underlying developmental processes get mechanistic insights about those, and in some cases, identify pivotal inflection points in trajectories that can be modified. They create a time to shift risk and vulnerability because of these insights. And they often are relevant to both windows of vulnerability, the negative cascades, as well as opportunities to improve trajectories with clinical and policy implications. And finally, it leads to rigorous models that allow experiments to be designed and have testable hypotheses. I want to illustrate that with a really, really simple process, which is just growth. And so I don't think we have a pointer. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. So this is just simply not growth charts, but growth velocity charts from birth to 18. And the sex differences are shown here. And what I want to say is that, of course, the rate of growth in infants is phenomenal. Infants are growing really, really, really fast. They don't stop growing, but the growing slows down and starts to plateau. And then right here, suddenly something happens. And the growth rate almost doubles for a short period of time, then quickly decelerates and the growth is slower and slower and slower until we stop growing at some time in early adulthood. And the female pattern is similar, but there's some differences. And of course, this is not some mysterious process of being an age or a grade level. This is the pubertal growth spurt. And this period of rapid growth also has a whole set of mechanistic processes, including some of the same hormones that are activated at puberty that contribute to accelerated growth as infants. But these are markers for underlying processes that have insights. And of course, it's practical. If you happen to be in this part of the life course, or this part of the life course during a famine or a war, you will be stunted and you'll have more impact. If you happen to have insufficient calcium and phosphorus or exercise in one of these windows, you're going to have differences in your bone. And during puberty, that will affect your risk for having bone problems late in life. These are windows of vulnerability, but also windows of opportunity. If we invest in preventing malnutrition and infections and bad social experiences here, it's going to have a larger impact. And similarly, if we invest in just things related to physical growth for vulnerable populations, it's going to have a bigger impact. And of course, it tells us something. It's not just about being a certain age. It is about when puberty begins. But of course, this focus on physical growth is just a metaphor. It is an example, but it's also a metaphor for a whole set of other processes. And that is learning processes that also are influenced by some of these same systems. And of course, learning and brain development are inextricably intertwined. There is no way to understand one of these alone without understanding the other. What we have proclivities to notice, pay attention to, and process as salient is going to be influenced by these systems. And as we learn, we shape these systems, and this continues. And of course, social information is by far the most compelling and important information. Certainly learning to walk and talk, which has its social dimensions, are fundamental. And yet, so much of what we're understanding about the sensitive windows of learning focus on these give and take, back and forth, peekaboo, synchrony, timing processes of interaction. And the importance of this, there's the old famous quote from the pediatrician Don Winnicott that there's no such thing as a baby. There's only a baby in someone. And this idea that fundamentally to understand a baby and the growth and development of a baby, we have to understand the relationships is not limited to infancy. And in fact, some of Winnicott's ideas and John Bowlby's ideas, which were pioneering important, crucial advances in our understanding about social bond formation during this window of time, also missed some important details that have emerged that challenge some aspects. And I put this quote from Sarah Hardy because there's a lot of evidence now that our model of attachment as being a single person is wrong. Because our species the emergence of hominins that were the ancestors to Homo sapiens were producing slower maturing, increasingly large brained, energetically more costly offspring with shorter interbirth intervals when they were walking across the plains with no safe places to escape predators. There is, as Sarah and others have argued, and the data are getting really compelling, there was no way this could have happened without alloparenting, without multiple individuals connecting to and bonding to infants that are so helpless, so incredibly dependent in many, many ways, and that infants are active agents in soliciting and interacting in those bonds. And survival of infants was directly related to those motivations and proclivities and success in creating multiple bonds. This is part of why so many of the researchers I really admire as doing inspiring work in early child development emphasize over and over again, it's the social and relational environment when learning and development is occurring in these action outcome social learning spaces that are really influencing so many aspects of these developmental trajectories. And of course, the point I want to underscore is this is just as true in slightly different ways for the second window of potentiated social learning, that having a social relationship framework for understanding brain development in adolescence and this action outcome reinforcement learning models and social reinforcement learning models about what is formative in this period of time when we are learning about ourself in relation to others, self versus others, self with others. We're learning to cooperate and to compete. We become very sensitive to where we are in the hierarchy, and we're motivated strongly not to be disrespected and to be admired. And the way to do that is often in learning how to cooperate and be part of teams and collaborative groups. And we, as the sociologist Rob Krasnow did in some showed in a beautiful set of longitudinal studies 20 or 30 years ago, what do adolescents want? Well, they want to fit in and they want to stand out. And they need both of those. And we smile because we recognize that this set of cooperation, competition, wanting to fit in, wanting to stand out, even in collectivist cultures, even in hunter-gatherer cultures, this wanting to belong, have emotional connections, to matter, to contribute is a deep, almost instinctual motivational proclivity that gets reactivated differently in adolescence. So first of all, when we say adolescence, this is from the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering Medicine, a promise of adolescence, a really nice summary of a lot of work in 2019. And one of the things I like about the way they framed this entire product from that work is, and when you define adolescence as from 10 to 25, that's a pretty wide block of the lifespan. And we can't make general comments about something so wide as 9 to 25-year-olds. And some aspects of these processes begin even before that. But the average onset of gonadarchy is here, okay? Average onset of menarche is here. Most of the things we care about as clinicians and epidemiologists in terms of behavioral, emotional, and mental health problems are emerging out here. And I'm going to argue today that as a developmental scientist, we want to be focusing here. Because this is when these systems start to change in new ways. So I want to make that case. When we think broadly, not just about mental health problems, but when we think about the morbidity and mortality in adolescence, which in many ways should be the healthiest physical part of the lifespan, and yet overall, morbidity and mortality jumps 200 to 300% because of problems with behavior and emotions, increasing rates of accidents, suicide, homicide, depression, alcohol, substance use, all the things that you know that are contributing to morbidity and mortality, and increasing rates of loneliness, emotional distress, obesity tends to get worse during adolescence and more difficult to treat. And there are a lot of long-term impacts, not just on mental health, but also on physical health. And of course, and this is a strange term, a sense of self, and yet these systems that represent self and other, and the feelings that are connected to those is another important part of what is happening. Now, this is a slide that helps to make a really key point, a couple key points. One is that when we think about self-injurious behavior, and if we were a clinician or epidemiologist, we would say, this is something really important from about age 15 well into middle age. But if we're a developmental scientist, aren't we more interested in what's happening between 10 and 14, when the rates go from virtually zero, or the lowest measurable, to the highest of the entire lifespan? This suggests something is happening. This is an inflection point. And it's not just in cutting. If we look at eating disorders, if you look at different eating disorders, the course is different, and the time and magnitude of the peak is different, and yet the inflection point is very similar. If you look at depression, you again see there's, and even the sex differences in depression emerge as well as the increase. Some of the worst things that humans do, murder, rape, forcible robbery, peak in early adolescence, but the inflection point is between 10 and 14. So, and this is a slide Danny Pine had that I really liked. This is from the 2024 JAMA Psychiatry article about evidence of global burden of disease. And what's interesting is to look at anxiety and depression in relation to all other health conditions in terms of disability, years lived with disability. And what you see is, and this is age stratified, if you look at 5 to 9-year-olds, anxiety disorders is the first mental disorder, but it's 8th. It's not even, it's just barely into the top 10. And depression is 40th. But by 10 to 14, anxiety is 4th, and depressive disorders are 8th. And by 15 to 19, it is the second leading cause of disability among all health conditions, and anxiety is third, and then into early adulthood. This is another way to think about that inflection point, that becoming such a huge part of the global burden of disability is carried heavily by anxiety and depression changes in this period of time. So this is the first main point of what I want to talk about today, is how we want to focus on early adolescence as an pivotal inflection point in the development of negative trajectories for behavioral, emotional, and mental health problems, but much more broadly in developing habits, preferences, mindsets, and social identities, including a sense of self and relationships, and in ways that have long-term impact, not only on health, but educational outcomes, economic outcomes, and social success, and affects many aspects of physical health and chronic diseases across the lifespan. So I'm going to give 2 examples, or 2 lines of evidence, and I'll pick one or 2 examples in each category. The first is, how might early adolescence create targets for early intervention? And I'm going to focus on sleep anxiety and depression, some things I spent about 15 years of my life with the team in Pittsburgh looking at very deeply. And the idea here is interrupting a cascade of processes early in the development of a problem like depression or anxiety and depression comorbidities by having an intervention that is an early change in a negative trajectory. And then the second thing is how not simply targeting problems, but promoting positive processes in this same window can improve health and well-being and functioning across multiple outcomes. So let's start with the first one. This is something that occupied my life for a long period of time, again, with an amazing team of people and a lot of grants and publications to take different slices into the system. And it's really about sleep and arousal regulation, and how emotion and emotion regulation and sleep and arousal regulation are intertwined in really complex ways. Of course, sleep has lots of different components, and the circadian system that changes at puberty, aspects of sleep change, the continuity patterning of sleep and the difficulties falling asleep. These are all components that include clinically interesting aspects. And of course, affect broadly is really complex. Even defining what arousal is or shifts in arousal and its role in emotion and motivation. And so these interacting systems were of great interest to us at many levels. And we included a big focus on some very practical aspects of clinical components of these processes, which focused on the fact, the basic fact that sleep is a transdiagnostic risk factor for so many problems. We all know that. We know that in our own lives, as well as we know from the epidemiology and clinical studies and meta-analyses. And we know, and going back to Kate McLaughlin and Susan Nolan Hoeksema's work, 15 years ago, that rumination and negative repetitive thoughts are a transdiagnostic factor in depression and anxiety and other mental health problems. And as people start looking more deeply, trying to pull out the individual components, we'll talk about that later, it appears to be rumination and negative repetitive thoughts are mediating the link between stressful life events and depression and anxiety, evidence longitudinal study. And this led a lot of people, including our team, to be very focused on how bedtime worry and rumination and repetitive negative thoughts are particularly problematic, because it's the transition into sleep that's being disrupted. And we were very interested in sleep and arousal more broadly in terms of anxiety, kids with risk for anxiety, either genetically, family history, and or diagnosed with anxiety, which creates a number of challenges for sleep because they enter adolescence with other vulnerabilities. They have more vigilance, they have more physiological arousal, they have predilection toward worry, bedtime, and negative thoughts at bedtime. And what are they thinking and worrying about when they're in middle school? They're thinking about social evaluation, their appearance, their popularity, being put down, being rejected, being bullied. These are the center. These become amplified as we go into puberty, the salience of these, and this becomes part of the spiral. And these negative spirals and cascades, that sleep problems are transdiagnostic risk factors, worry and rumination is transdiagnostic risk factor. Doing these things at bedtime, worrying and ruminating, is a particularly problematic because it interferes with going to sleep and it influences the sleep processes themselves, as Dana McMakin and others' work is showing, that it will change the gist processing within sleep to fall asleep in a state of negative thoughts and negative emotions. And so these increased tendencies in adolescents to worry and ruminate, have sleep problems, and have emotional disorders are part of these spirals, and this negative cognitive and affective state, it relates to a negative overgeneralization of things you learned before you went to sleep. So this is part of a big spiral that we and others have been fascinated by as having insights that are clinically relevant. We started looking at this in the CATS study with a team. I mean, Boris Birmohar, there was we had just a wonderful team of people at that time. And we did this longitudinal study with a lot of neurobiological components, treating 9 to 13-year-olds with anxiety disorders. And and then Dana McMakin really led a lot of this work at the time, focusing on sleep. We showed that 91% of the kids with anxiety disorder had clinical level sleep problems at the beginning. Even after they finished treatment for their anxiety, 78% of them still had sleep problems. And focusing with a cognitive behavioral intervention, targeting those sleep problems, especially bedtime worry and rumination, by using savoring and switching skills, practicing during the day, identifying uplifting moments, repeating those at bedtime to push away. Kids can't lay on the beach mentally and imagine, it's too boring. They need active ways to engage positive emotions, as well as other basic sleep hygiene, behavioral aspects of sleep. And this resulted in improving not only their sleep, but the other trajectories in their well-being. And this is also an example of a developmental science early intervention. It's targeting a developmental window early adolescence. It's targeting specific processes like worry and rumination and negative cognition and attentional biases with savoring switching. It's again replacing these habits and proclivities with positive habits and proclivities, and it's influencing at a neurobehavioral level the way we process information and that gets encoded during sleep. And there's some really nice papers in this space. And of course, we aren't the only ones who have been focusing on this. I mean, Nick Allen and his team in Oregon had very interested in this spiral, and Ron Rapay's group has done some really wonderful work focusing on these questions. In a 2019 paper, which I really liked, they described a set of disorders that emerge in adolescence, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, eating disorders, and major depression that shared some common features. And those features were emotional difficulties, sensitivities to social evaluation, more frequently occurring in females, and frequently co-occurring with sleep problems. And I would add, they are emerging in adolescence, as we showed earlier. And interestingly, and there's some really lovely papers from this group. This is one of the more recent ones that I thought was really, really fascinating. This was from a longitudinal study of 528 youth, 6 annual waves from 11 to 16, really nice statistical models, cross-like panels. And the conclusion, it's actually worth reading the paper, but the conclusion from these findings is that sleep disturbance and repetitive negative thoughts should be targeted simultaneously in the prevention and treatment of this set of social emotional disorders in adolescence. That is exactly what that savoring and switching intervention we had designed 15 years earlier was aiming at, doing these simultaneously. And the evidence that this is a promising way to tip that trajectory in that window of development is to me a really exciting example of moving from these developmental science mechanistic insights and the complex spirals to windows of opportunity to intervene developmentally and in the development of processes. But I want to shift now to the sort of other side of that story, and that is not just interrupting negative processes in this way, but also promoting positive processes. And again, thinking about these interactions across these multiple systems. And I want to just briefly review some really complex, it's a complex literature. I was so glad you mentioned the Crone and Dahl paper because it's been, I remember without going into the backstory, writing that after Evelyn and I were debating something fiercely, and we wrote this paper together, and it became a framework for thinking differently about these systems. And it's like so many areas, the field has accelerated in some really exciting ways. I'm going to just summarize some of this work, that there's greater activation compared to adults in adolescence when they view images of peers, social rewards in neural systems associated with valuation, social cognition, and there's an increased salience of social value feedback, whether it's positive. Being admired is more thrilling when you're in adolescence after puberty, and being diminished, disrespected, or put down is more aversive. And the motivational salience of wanting, in other words, action outcome, finding ways to gain respect, gain admiration, gain positive social value, and avoid disrespect really seems to be, the dial for that seems to be turned up. The incentive salience goes up in association with puberty. And there's a number of studies showing this. And one, in a really practical way, well, actually one more set of findings more broadly, is this idea that attentional and motivational salience for gaining social acceptance, respect, and autonomy and agency is increasing specifically in puberty, and its relevance to social and relational learning, and the sensitivity to social hierarchies and status and popularity, as people have been describing long before the scientists started to look at this more rigorously. One of my favorite small studies that we did, Steve Hinshaw, a student of Steve's, and Wouter van den Bos and I, with Stephanie Cardus, it's a really interesting bidding auction task where learning how to bid optimally, the young people could do quite effectively through trial and error. But if the outcome showed that you won the auction, it shifted you to overbid when you had pubertal hormones starting. You started to value popularity over money. You could make more money in the task by making cool decisions, but it's why auctions really work. This overbidding, because you want to win, emerges. This was all girls, by the way. So there's a number of studies, and actually the LaFontaine and Solesson study in 2010, which is again a classic that's been cited so often, where they measured carefully trade-offs and priorities. Peer status overtook social and academic goals in this window of time in really carefully designed studies. And these are part of a larger proclivity for social connection, making emotional connections, belonging, mattering to others, and creating these strong emotional bonds and forming enduring relationships, which is probably how these proclivities evolved. So this has led us to use a term and a construct and think carefully about how to measure this, about the feeling of mattering. And I want to make clear, this is an appraisal. It is a rapid appraisal that you matter and that your actions matter. And there's a whole psychology of mattering, and there's some disagreements about the best way to measure it, but it's been a really fascinating framework for thinking about these systems. And that puberty, something about puberty seems to increase the motivational salience of gaining social value and this enhanced sensitivity to being valued socially, and learning how to do that, gain social value by doing things that matter to others, is part of a window of pro-social learning opportunities. That is, we can gain these feelings of mattering through meaningful, purposeful contributions and helping. And this is probably something that happened very, very often in most of human history, and opportunities to successfully and authentically and gain genuine feelings of being valued in these ways in adolescence may be a really formative aspect of learning. And we wrote a paper on this, and that this learning to care as an affective motivation, not just caring about people, but caring for them in an emotional way, seems to happen more easily as you move into puberty. And this paper with Wouter van der Vos, who's been doing a lot of computational social reinforcement learning models with experiments, really updating information from peers, has been, who's a partner on this paper, and Emma Armstrong-Carter, who's looked a lot at caretaking as a way to learn. And this was a paper where we really unpack some of these ideas in a very specific way. And just to be clear, in our version of mattering, there are, and in fact, there's some organizational psychology that really shows this is true. There are two main factors in mattering. One is feeling valued and appreciated, and we all like that, and adolescents like it more. But the other is that your actions make a difference. If you get in an organization great feedback that the people who supervise you say you're great and they appreciate you, but they don't name a single thing that you actually did, it doesn't land the same way. It is an appraisal that your efforts make a difference. It is part of this human feedback system. And adolescents are really sensitive to that. They don't want to be told that they're good. They don't want, inauthentic praise that they're special. They want to be noticed for their actions and contributions. I want to just give one example of some studies. My good friend and colleague, David Yeager, and I, and Carol Dweck was part of this. We're fascinated by how these subtle shifts in feelings could influence even a behavioral intervention, school-based interventions. And this idea that as puberty increases our sensitivity to status and respect, a lot of behavioral interventions that say, you should eat healthy foods, you should not smoke cigarettes because it will be bad for you, are diminishing messages. It's taking autonomy away from kids. And the tobacco industry figured this out a long time ago when they used warnings that actually made kids more likely to want to smoke. And because adults telling adolescents what's not good for them is the cost in diminishing their feelings of respect and autonomy backfires. And David did a meta-analysis showing that many well-designed school-based health interventions stopped working and became iatrogenic as kids get into this age. And the Truth Campaign and smoking is a historical example. And so then Chris Bryan and David designed a school-based intervention for healthy eating using this same principle. That is, taking a pretty solid behavioral intervention about eating that says you will be better in these ways and it'll be good for your life and healthy, and flipping it, not to you're some lame kid that follows what adults tell them to eat, but rather by standing up to big sugar. And they actually took real ads, marked them up, that healthy eaters aren't just these lame nerds who do what their parents and teachers say, but they're independent-minded people who stand up for against the junk food industry and make the world a better place. And this work, the first paper was in 2019. It's been followed up some more. That flip to a values-aligned intervention, the same behavioral intervention with this added component, changed real behavior. They had coupons for being in the experiment that they could use with vending machines. They chose healthier food, and this maintained a month later. Other groups have taken a similar approach for these value-aligned messaging systems that show that a shift in these feelings can lead to behavioral changes and sustained behavioral changes. But the last big frame I want to bring, let me just check the time, is the role of rapidly changing and increasingly technocentric world that young people are growing up in. Where are we for time? 9:12. Okay, so I'm going to go a little fast, but I want to really frame not only the examples I'm going to use, but a broader set of issues that go to the heart of this relational learning, the role of relational learning in adolescence in a formative period of time, and how that is being influenced by the vulnerabilities, not just of social media and technology, which the evidence that they are causal is actually pretty weak in really well done studies. Candace Odgers has done some really, and Amy Ogden at Oxford, some of the best done studies show that the effect sizes directly from screen time and social media are relatively small. And yet, the capacity for these technologies and increasingly AI to be part of these negative spirals is getting more and more compelling for vulnerable individuals. And this is raising some really key questions. Yet, we shouldn't just use the negative lens about all of these technological changes are just creating vulnerabilities, because they're also creating unique opportunities for young people to create, connect, to contribute, and to be earning, to have ways to contribute in authentically valued ways. Which brings me to the third part of these motivational proclivities that are quite fascinating. And that is, and Andrew Fellini calls it a need to contribute. I would say a motivational proclivity to contribute that is quickly rewarded for these reasons. Evelyn Crone and Andrew wrote a really lovely paper in Annual Review of Psychology in 2020 on this idea. And that is that not only are adolescents developing new capacities for and motivations for contributing in small and large ways, actions that benefit others at a community or societal level, they also gain more rewarding feelings by accomplishing those goals, those pro-social goals, when the feedback is personally meaningful to them. And the evidence for this is getting stronger and stronger. I want to just take one last loop into the evolutionary frame. This is a fascinating series of studies. I'm just going to, there's 4 or 5 studies since this 2002 studies, but this graph really tells the story. And this is work in hunter-gatherers living in traditional environments and it's very simply looking at net calorie production by individuals. How many calories do they bring to their group and how many do they consume? Obviously, infants are just purely negative, but the age at which you begin to be contributing food at a measurable level more than you eat. And anybody who's raised adolescents knows this space in adolescence and the pubertal growth spurt where you just can't keep enough food in the house because they're growing at twice the rate, putting on muscle and bone. They are eating enormously and they're awkward. They are not good hunters. They're not good gatherers. They are exactly the way adolescents, we picture them, not as klutzes, but they haven't developed the skills. The peak skills for killing an animal with a spear or a bow or a trap or running them down or extractive foraging, getting enough food that you bring it for other people is out here between 40 and 50. This is enormous expertise that needs to be acquired to bring back not only what you need to eat, but for others. This is an intergenerational transfer, not just for the first few years of life, but well through adolescence. And if we did not, or our ancestors did not, have a strong proclivity to contribute back, how would this sustain? How would a small group of hunter-gatherers who are at the edge of starvation day to day for long periods of time continue to invest enormous amounts of nutrition into this window of time if there wasn't a powerful motivation to contribute? And this, again, these are 4 other studies showing the peak productivity in hunting and extractive foraging in the 30s and 40s. This has been well investigated. And this sharing motivated not just for yourself or for your kin or the people you have relationships with, but to your tribe and community, wanting to contribute in larger ways is part of this cycle. And this suggests a developmental window for learning how your developing self can gain social value with authentic contribution. And there are lots of ways to do that. You don't have to just be the best hunter. Culture is amplified. Innovation is amplified by young people who find ways to use new technologies for impact. And that's been going on throughout our evolutionary history. And the motivational proclivity to find a niche, to fit in and stand out has deep underpinnings. We are, by all measures, the most pro-social species that's ever existed. Not just by genetic programming for specific roles to cooperate, by being motivated to cooperate in flexible ways that has allowed us to succeed at a level of this planet no other species has ever accomplished. But we don't only cooperate. We are arguably the most cooperative species, but we're also capable of the most selfish, hoarding, evil, individualistic Machiavellian behavior as well. And those dual aspects of our deepest proclivities and values are undoubtedly shaped by our adolescent experiences. Adolescence across evolutionary history were times young people interacted with peers with less adult supervision and worked out how to cooperate and how to compete. And it is both. Humans, even chimpanzees, cannot gain rank without alliances. If you can't understand the goals, wants, and needs of others, you can't even be Machiavellian. And if you don't care about others, it's harder to do the complex cooperative tasks that are so necessary across human history. And this interaction between our proclivity and rewarding experiences, learning to cooperate, and our ability to still be fiercely competitive at times and want to win, how those systems become calibrated with each other in adolescence are probably really, really formative in ways that we are just beginning to understand. This is relevant at another scale. I want to finish up with the last couple slides because, as I said in the beginning, 90% of the 1.2 billion adolescents coming of age in the world are growing up in low and middle income countries. The darkness of the color on those maps is the median age of the population. And most wealthy countries are getting older and older and older and having less infants. And as infant survival has gotten better and childhood survival has gotten better in difficult areas of the world, there's more adolescence. And these are converging to create a potential crisis and potential opportunities. Because as competition for decreasing resources and money and the basic things we need to live gets more fierce, it brings out the worst in people. And yet, if these young people growing up amidst really unprecedented global changes and challenges, climate change, migration, immigration, the wars, conflict, economic challenges, and all these technological changes, if this just amplifies the fierceness of competition and ugly policies about supporting people with these disadvantages, that has a really concerning trajectory. And yet, young people are also growing up with increasing access to all the world's information. Sources of knowledge, communication, connection, learning opportunities. And they are the rapid adapters and adopters of innovation. And AI is creating opportunities to get quality of information, if it's used correctly, that never existed. But most importantly, if all this does is intensify competition, if you're in a country where if you don't score in the top 3% of the national exam, you feel like a loser, that is not healthy. And the narrow bottleneck status competition, where people feel like winners and losers in a zero-sum game, is incredibly counterproductive compared to there are almost infinite ways to make meaningful contributions in the world. We need more young people contributing in thousands of different ways, finding niches and teams to contribute authentically. That is not a zero-sum game. That is a win-win-win set of opportunities to engage young people in positive ways as contributors, having them earn status of respect, even competitively in teams, by positive actions, making a positive difference in a formative window of development. And I think this has, it creates compelling challenges in our contemporary times, some of them feeling quite urgent. And it's, of course, much broader than mental health. And yet, I think it is central to thinking about how to have a positive impact on the behavior, emotions, and development of young people in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
We ask for you to use it so people on Zoom can hear as well.
Okay. So I was telling you that I work with, is this not on? With kids with neurodevelopmental disorders who struggle a lot with social interaction, particularly in adolescence. And so we've been wondering about ways that we might be able to manufacture some of these positive social experiences without relying on peers who might not act how we want them to. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts about to what extent it might be possible to engender some of these feelings of acceptance, and how much can adults or AI or paid Confederates
it's a great set of questions, and it goes to the heart of something that I skipped over a little too quickly. And there's some really elegant work in this space. And that is that on one hand, there's great opportunities for some communication skills to be scaffolded. I saw this really wonderful example of working with autistic kids, helping them learn how to tell a joke, getting feedback from an agent. And it really helped them develop the skills. But the yin to the yang is, and this is back to some of Bowder's work, the actual reinforcement is the activation of a feeling. It's not enough for someone to say, that was a funny joke, if they don't laugh, okay? And so, and it's why I mentioned the David Yeager studies and Chris Bryant. As kids move into puberty, their bullshit detectors get really good. And that's not to say all of them do. And obviously some kids have less of that. But inauthentic, positive feedback, saying the right words without landing the right feelings, is exactly why those school-based interventions don't work. because the tone is wrong. And anybody who's parent an adolescent and realize they praise them for something they did where their intention is to say, oh, work harder on that math because that's going to help you. They hear that instantly and they look at you like, you're not manipulating me. They don't use those words. And so the idea that if we design experiments where the feedback loop is working for that kid, they're getting the feelings they need. But zooming in early in the design of the intervention to really be scrutinizing that it's landing the right feelings. And now those skills can build. They're exciting. It's exciting to be able to tell a joke. It's exciting to know how to engage in a new interaction, even online. Some of the skill building, I think it's a great example because AI can do amazing personalized ways to learn for particular kids for their strengths. But and if we allow AI to become, when kids have more AI friends than real friends, they're going to be missing things deeply in terms of how these systems evolve. And it's this corny term, authentic or genuine feelings, but we all know what we mean. Jim, good to see you.
Hi, Ron. Great to see you, and thank you for just generating so many cool ideas. Flashing back to my own adolescence, the process of adolescence, it seems to me, is so exclusionary in one sense. You think about kids in high schools, and we recommend, find your tribe. But when you look at it by adolescent reports of what their social world at schools is, it seems like it's made of these very small and quite exclusionary groups. Any ideas about which would only seem to heighten one's feelings about social exclusion as a central worry? Any creative ideas about what schools can do to sort of break that down a little bit and more opportunities for exploring without risk of undue harm? This is so briefly, and then we can have a longer conversation about this later, but briefly, I think it's the reason I've been finding myself at more convenings and research retreats in the education space, because they recognize that the current incentive system and social feedback loops are not working in many of these settings, because when the explicit reward for your grades and your rank is what they say matters, but what you want to feel is valued by peers and teachers. And so there's some lovely work mapping complex social networks. And just to give a simple example, it's an empirical question. There are some high schools, big high schools, where if you map, there's 7 different areas of identity that are ranked within that. You could be this high in the drama club or in the nerd chess group, whatever, not short of labels. But in other words, what's salient for your rank are different. And there's other high schools where they will tell you that on an interview, but when you look at the actual social network interactions, everybody knows the most popular kids across those differences. Now, the question is having lots of flexible niches healthier? You can find your niche. If you're at a high school that says, oh yeah, the chess club or the math competition, like whether that creates real status or prestige that feels real to the kids could be drastically different. And so people are working on how you're shaping some of these, the supports for these social networks can be done in more positive ways. And it's a really, really important set of issues, and the incentives in the schools. And that's, I think there's no more important place to be thinking about these things than in middle school as well as in high school. Thanks.
Well, thank you.